All right. Welcome to incorporating prevention into safe harbor protocol work. So all of your phone lines are currently muted. We will be unmuting all the lines at the end of the presentation if you have questions or comments. In the meantime, feel free to chat in any questions or comments throughout the webinar, and we will address them kind of as they come up or at the end, depending. When we do unmute the lines at the end, just make sure that you then mute yourself until you're ready to ask your question, just to eliminate the majority of the background noise that we'll have. All right. My name is Sarah Florman, and I'm the Trafficking Policy Coordinator at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And my primary job is to work with safe harbor protocol teams all across Minnesota that are developing community-specific coordinated responses to trafficking and exploitation of youth.
Hello, I am Adriana Perez, and I will be co-hosting this webinar with some folks, and I am the Prevention Program Coordinator at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Prior to my role here, I have done direct service advocacy in shelter and with youth, and now my role at MNCASA is really all things prevention, so I'm really excited that we're having these conversations. I will be doing some intro to prevention work, and then typically my role is all things prevention, whether you're a member of MNCASA or not. So if you have any follow-up questions around stuff we talk about today, please connect with all of us at MNCASA. We're happy to help.
Hi everyone, my name is Sam Schmidt and I'm the prevention specialist here at Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Prior to working for MNCASA, I was working in higher education, doing prevention work with students and student movements. I work closely with Adri and doing all things prevention here, but primarily my focus is on community level prevention solutions. I'm so glad to be here with all of you.
All right, now if everybody would be willing to chat in who you are, where you work, and anything you're trying to get out of this webinar in particular. Also look in the chat box for directions on how to change your name on the participant list, because we had fun issues with the webinar link earlier. So you are, a lot of you, logged in as Adriana Perez. So if you'd like to not be that, check the chat box for instructions. And then, yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and what you're hoping to get out of this today. The basic objectives are going to be to discuss the frameworks of prevention. This is something that gets talked about in a lot of different fields, but it's new to a lot of safe harbor responders. We're going to identify some strategies for engaging in prevention for trafficking and exploitation. And then we're also going to talk about ways to incorporate prevention into protocol development and systems change work. So the question came up, how does prevention fit into the work of protocol development? And this question has come up repeatedly in the couple years that I've been working with Safe Harbor protocol teams in Minnesota. As they're developing their local response, they're also wanting to engage in some efforts to both prevent and also to then intervene in situations in more of a long-term, non-acute way. When we're talking about systems change, there's a lot of ways to incorporate prevention into that. So talking with teams a lot about the different things that they can do or the different resources that they can tap into to make sure that those efforts are going on in their community. People really want to do prevention around this issue. There's so many ways to include that opportunity in the response. And there's so much overlap between different forms of prevention and the types of work that Safe Harbor protocol teams can do.
Yeah, so we're just going to start with kind of a basic framework that MNCASA uses. We call this our holistic approach. We really like this model because it shows all the pieces of things that we believe should be happening within the work we do. So just to frame up this model, it is like the small circle to a big circle, but what we're really trying to show is everything is within one circle together, and that we're starting kind of on a micro to macro level frame up versus something being bigger or more important than the other. So we have victims and survivors at the middle, because really that is at the center of all of our work, is how do we serve victims and survivors, and how are we doing work that is best for victims and survivors or to prevent future victim survivors. So really at the center of our work is victims and survivors, and then we have direct service advocacy, systems advocacy, and prevention as kind of three main pillars of where our work might fall in. And so again, this is just showing prevention is on the outer edge because it can be more macro level, and then all these other things kind of move in to closer contact with direct service with victims and survivors. So this is a really great image just showing how important all of us are in this work, and that we all have a piece to play in the sexual violence movement. And so we call it our holistic approach, in that we have to be doing every piece of this to be doing really good, successful work. And we'll dive into a little bit more of these coming up.
Next.
Yes, please. So I'm going to start with a story. I'm sure some of you, just seeing who's on the call, are familiar with this story or have heard it before. So we're just going to give you a nice little recap around our three siblings. So it's a beautiful day, not unlike today probably in Minnesota, you know, a nice spring sunny day. We have three siblings who are walking down the river, and they settle in to have a nice little picnic when all of a sudden they hear shouting from the river. And when they look, they see that people are struggling to swim, they're floating down the river, and they kind of just keep coming, and they're all screaming for help. So the first sibling runs into the river and starts just grabbing people and throwing them onto the shore or helping them grab onto a rock. The second sibling runs up the river a little ways and then jumps in and starts teaching people how to swim. They start working on building a dam. They're doing anything they can to kind of keep the folks getting out of the river or being stopped and able to stand and be safe even though they're still in the river. And then the third sibling takes off running all the way down the river till they're almost out of sight. And the two other siblings shout at her, where are you going? Like, there's so much work to do here. You can't leave us. And the sibling turns around and says, I'm going upstream to see why people are falling in the river in the first place, and so we can stop them from continuing to fall in. So let's talk about what the story means. We can flip to the next slide. Our first sibling, we often think of as kind of being the direct service advocate. They're going in and they're just really trying to get people to safety, out of the river really quickly, get them to shore. What are their basic needs that they have right at that moment? And so we see them as really that micro level work, working directly with one individual or potentially one family. And they do a lot of different things. We have some direct service advocates on the call. They're often providing support, potentially explaining options, helping victims and survivors choose the path that's best for them, and then navigating systems that might be down that path. So whether that's making a police report, getting an HRO, having access to housing or benefits, and then some direct service advocates identify as really trying to help empower victims and survivors to refine their voice. And so that's a piece of that work. And so that's kind of our first sibling who's getting in there, directly connecting with someone and getting them to safety. Next slide. So then we have our systems change advocates, who we typically link to that second sibling, who are either trying to kind of disrupt the flow of the river, so folks are stopped or slowed in that to get help, or again, kind of directly getting them right out of danger into safety. So this can be community level work. It really involves bigger groups of people, not always kind of that one-on-one support as we see with that first sibling. They do a wide range of stuff, and I'm just looking from the folks who are on the call, I think a lot of you fit into doing some sort of systems change role. So again, that's really educating community potentially, collaborating with other systems or within systems, promoting change or finding the best ways to serve victims and survivors and your community in general through systems work. And then Sarah, do you want to add a little more to this as well?
Yep, absolutely. So the systems change role is a huge piece of what the protocol teams are here to do. We're focused on systems change within our communities. And so we have team members and a presence that is credible and has the authority and kind of the sway to really advocate for some of these changes. So the systems change type of prevention work is really something that our protocol teams focus on.
All right, and then we have that third sibling that ran all the way upstream, and that is kind of how we frame up what a preventionist role would be. And so they work typically anywhere from the micro to macro level. They do lots of different things to really address why is sexual violence happening in the first place, or why are those people falling into the river. And we are going to talk a lot more about kind of what prevention means, some different frameworks around it, and how MNCASA talks about it. But just really helping folks connect to that story that a preventionist is really going to address the problem at its cause versus stepping in and kind of those different pieces that a victim and survivor might be in floating down that river. So they can address root causes. We'll talk a lot about that in policy change, changing environments, challenging norms, providing education. There's a wide range of activities prevention folks can do and how that can look. And we will break a lot of that down for you and also provide some concrete examples of how you can integrate that into your current work that you're doing. Thank you. So when we talk about prevention at MNCASA, we are often talking about primary prevention. And I think this is just important to let folks know ahead of time kind of our framework, because we will be saying prevention a lot. And what we really mean is focusing on this idea of primary prevention. So preventing violence before it even occurs. And digging into that a little deeper, looking at prevention as before someone can cause harm and before someone might experience harm. So it's not just reducing victimization, it's also reducing perpetration. And so we're really getting at that core meaning of prevention, of stopping any form of violence before it is caused or experienced. So just keeping that in mind, we will talk about some other types of prevention, but typically at MNCASA, when we're doing prevention work, we're really trying to focus on that before violence is experienced or caused. Next slide, please. So this is a tool I really like to share with folks, and we can send it out. It's actually an entire report from the CDC. It's called the Stop SV Technical Package. And I think it just really helps frame up different evidence-based strategies to do prevention. And so as you can see, it's just a really nice graphic and shows that there's these big concepts and strategies that we can do, and then we could break those down into actual tangible prevention activities. So we typically tend to focus on the stop part. The SV is the support victims and survivors to lessen harm, and that is super important, and we need to be doing that. However, when we talk about that primary prevention frame up, we're talking more about these 4 other strategies at play. So promoting social norms that protect against violence, teaching skills to prevent sexual violence, providing opportunities to empower and support girls and women. We recognize that this piece is really important and that we should be thinking about it kind of broader than just girls and women. So holding that with a little bit of a grain of salt, especially when we talk about different diverse populations and what phrases like women and girls actually means and how that can best serve communities and what that looks like in different communities. So just kind of holding that one for what it is. And then also creating protective environments. And so we're not going to spend time today necessarily breaking down each of these strategies specifically, but you will see when we're starting to give you tangible activities to do, they do address different parts of these evidence-based strategies on doing prevention work. So it's a really helpful report if you want to learn more about prevention, especially what the CDC is recommending prevention looks like in communities. So we wanted to share this graphic with you all today, and then we'll also share the report with you later if you want to dig into that a little deeper. So another good just general framework for how we talk about prevention. All right, Sarah, next slide, please. Perfect. So going off kind of these tools and frameworks, I do want to share the spectrum of prevention with you all. I'm going to tell you another story, so settle in for that. So just giving you this basic idea of the spectrum of prevention. So we can think of prevention as happening on the spectrum, which is really nice. So there's many parts that are at play at the same time. So this isn't like a stepping ladder, and it's not you pick one and engage in it. We really need to be doing all of them kind of happening together. And so you might look at some of these and say, how are we supposed to do that? That is a lot of different steps that can look really different. So we want to share just one nice example of how you can really stretch one project all the way across the spectrum versus picking pieces from it. So there was an advocate who was doing medical call out, and she would go to the hospital and she was starting to see that victims and survivors that she was meeting with often came in between 2 and 3 a.m. They had been downtown in that community. They were often at one or two of the same bars before their assaults happened. And so this advocate really wanted to look at like, well, why is this happening? I'm really seeing this trend. How do we address it? There's got to be a way to stop stories that have all of these commonalities. So what this advocate did is they started at that bottom, strengthening individual knowledge and skills, and they did some research around how can we prevent this from happening. And they didn't even really know what prevention was until they started doing this research. And when they were really looking at how we can do prevention strategies, they were looking at the Stop SV technical package, and they realized they couldn't be doing this work alone. So they started to foster coalitions and networks, and they built a team that had campus folk, it had law enforcement, medical, some community members who were engaged in this work, and they all came together to create this idea of doing a safe bar initiative. And so from there, after having those two ideas, they knew that they had to educate providers. So they went to bars and they did bystander intervention training. They looked at the organization's policies. So they're doing that change organizational practices to really help these bar staff identify signs, become bystander interventions. They completely changed some of the signs that were even displayed at these bars and restaurants to show that staff was trained, to say this was a safe place. They let folks know how to report if they did experience any harassment or saw things that made them uncomfortable. So they were really changing what the organizational practice and feel was. So we've now done 4 of these already, and this is one project. And from there, they went, none of this is actually going to matter if our community isn't aware that this exists and that these are safe bars, and what does that even mean? So then they did some community tabling events, some radio ads, newspaper ads, letters to the editor, anything they could do to kind of promote this work within their community and let folks know that, hey, here are some bars that have signed on to work with us. Here's the training they've done. They want their space to be safe for folks to attend, and here's what they can do to help you. And then from there, they even got their local policy changed to any bar that partook in sexual violence training would then get a discount on their liquor license. So through this work, they actually changed their own local policy and legislation to be supportive of their prevention work. So I think that just really shows that the spectrum of prevention looks like it hits really far levels, and this work can be really complicated even on just one of those levels. But it's not about doing all of those separately. It's really about finding an activity or a strategy or something your community needs, and then how do we stretch it all the way across these different forms of prevention work. Sarah, were you going to add on?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think this story can be really applicable to the work that Safe Harbor teams are doing, especially in terms of looking at how to expand on your efforts. So you can start small. You've got team members from a variety of different disciplines. Some of them are doing direct services, some are not. So folks are in different positions to have different involvement in these efforts. But when you have this team together, you can think about all of these different issues and expand on things that you're already doing and find ways to look at making long-term change with some of the just individual efforts that different team members have been working on.
Yeah, you're all already fostering coalitions and networks just by being a part of a team or being aware of who your local team is. And so then it's really addressing what work have you already been doing. Some of you might be in a place to think of new work to do, but a lot of times it's what are we already doing and how do we slightly adapt or stretch it to make it prevention and meet what our community needs. So when you do prevention work, it also involves a lot of community connection and seeing what are the trends that you're seeing, how are those being experienced, and then how do we move that to be upstream and prevent those continuous themes that we see to address the needs that our community wants. So like Sarah said, it's really not about kind of thinking of new ideas and broadening. It's what do you already have? How can you continue to foster that? And then what are some slight adaptations you can be making on your team? So I want to share our key concepts. We gave you kind of a brief definition of what we mean by prevention and how you can really take one concept and stretch it. And now I want to share some ideas that we have at MnCASA around how to do prevention work and how to make it successful. So really what we've noticed is you want your prevention work to be positive and actionable. So many of us on the call can probably relate to a time where we've heard, don't do this, don't act this way, this is not okay, this is not acceptable. And we get all of these ideas of how not to act or what's inappropriate without ever giving folks that flip side messaging of what does a respectful workplace actually look like? How do we actually ask folks for consent? What are things that are okay, healthy behaviors? So we see a lot of the negative side in our work, and how do we flip that then to show folks what is positive, what is actionable, what are the things we're actually wanting them to do? So I think that can be a helpful frame up when we start doing prevention work. We're really asking folks to change their behavior, and then we have to show them and tell them what that behavior is that we want to see. Folks also want action. We can't just say, you know, let's prevent sexual violence. Like, what is the action that needs to happen within your community? Prevention takes so much creativity, and that's kind of what's fun about it, is you can really adapt and shift and make things your own in these creative ways. So finding what are some really amazing resources that already exist in your community. Maybe you have a lot of artists and your community is very art-based. How can you be creative, like literally creative, right, in your prevention work in your community? And with that, you're going to need partnerships. Prevention cannot happen on our own. There can't be one person or even just one small group of folks doing prevention. We all have a role to play in it, and we need to engage with folks in our community to show them how they can engage. Even when we think about wanting to do education within schools, you need to develop a partnership with the school to be able to do that. We can't just kind of show up, knock on the school's door and try and get in. It's all about partnership building. And that can be hard because that takes a long time to gain trust in functioning partnerships. So letting you all know, prevention is great. This will not happen overnight for you. It will take time to build, but to continue building that is going to benefit you and your community and your teams in so many different ways. We also want to evaluate our prevention work, which can be super challenging because how do you evaluate things that are hopefully not happening anymore? And so that's where some of that creativity comes into play too. There's a lot of curriculum that already exists that has an evaluation component to it, kind of pre-post tests. You can do evaluation where you're just observing what changes you see happening around you or changes in your community, documenting conversations you have with people to really capture how folks are responding to different things. The hard part with evaluating prevention is we kind of just hope it's working, but we really need to see some of that data in different ways, both numbers and actual stories and change that we're seeing to show that our efforts are being successful in preventing sexual violence. It has to be community driven. We can't be doing prevention work in our communities without actually knowing what our community's needs and wants are. This can be hard too because some people really want to connect and be engaged in prevention, but not all of our communities are even ready to address prevention. Some communities are just starting to be heard and seen as folks who experience sexual violence at really high rates. And it's important that we meet those needs before we start to try and pile prevention onto that. So really connecting with your community, what are they looking for? What do they need? And what's their role to play in prevention? Because we don't want to come in and put prevention onto our communities and put prevention onto our teams if that's not something they're bought in yet to engage in. So really looking at doing some assessments potentially, having conversations with your partners, and what ways can you best serve everyone in your community. And then I give this caveat of really wanting to balance things that are evidence-based and things that are promising practices. Evidence-based things are great. Obviously, they've been tested, they've been evaluated, they've had really heavy funding thrown at them to make sure they work. But that's the trick, right? What programs are getting access to that funding or getting access to that time to become evidence-based versus prevention work that's happening that's actually showing to be really successful, but just can't get that kind of stamp on it to be evidence-based. So one really good example is the Safe Dates curriculum. It is evidence-based. However, it hasn't actually been updated in quite a few years. So it can be a really good curriculum if you kind of adapt it and bring it forward with you, but it really doesn't hold up or register with youth anymore. And so it's that balance of, yes, it's evidence-based, but is it really doing what we want it to anymore? And really digging into having that balance of, we know this is an effective strategy, but what are ways we can be creative with that strategy to actually work within our communities and not just be from a book that is stamped by the government to say, yes, this works. And again, that's kind of why evaluation is really important, so that we know what we're doing is working, even if it's not going to get kind of that official, yes, this is an evidence-based curriculum to it. And a lot of evidence-based curriculum or programs are really for kind of middle-class white students. And we know that is not all of our communities, and that is not the majority of our communities. And so really looking at what are these other works that are happening that maybe don't have that stamp yet, but are showing to be just as good or can be adapted or are really serving those communities who are needing prevention work that aren't getting it in that evidence-based way.
As Adrienne mentioned earlier, primate prevention tries to get at the root of violence and prevent harm from occurring. And in this slide, we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like for trafficking prevention more specifically. A quick note about the triangle graphic on the right side of the screen. The triangle shows distinctions among different responses to trafficking. It's adapted from like a family violence lens, but it does a good job showing the differences among primate prevention, early intervention, and crisis response. So the graphic isn't suggesting that one level is more important than the other, but rather it suggests that they should all be happening at the same time. So it's not a hierarchy, just simply a way to distinguish the different kinds of work. Primate prevention also wants to reduce the number of people who are at risk and in current crisis. So ideally, the pyramid will get smaller at the top. Unfortunately, we won't be discussing crisis response in this webinar since it's kind of out of the scope of prevention, but we will be talking a little bit about early intervention later in the webinar. There are lots of different strategies, but what all of these primate prevention strategies share in common is that they try to prevent harm from occurring. It tries to prevent the conditions that make people vulnerable to harm and stops normalizing exploitation and abuse in our wider culture. In the context of trafficking, primate prevention might look like building awareness. There are a lot of myths about trafficking, and we want to help people understand what trafficking actually is or ask them how they're seeing it happen in their own community, so that folks have a better understanding of what the problem is. Primary prevention also looks like family wellness, so education or programs that emphasize family wholeness and healthy attachments in families. And the idea is to promote safety at home and prevent family life disruption. This is particularly important for LGBTQ youth or other marginalized populations who are at high risk of becoming vulnerable due to homelessness or insecurity with food or housing. So we want to address the conditions that create vulnerability when people don't have the needs, their basic needs met. We want to make sure that people have safe first families and home conditions. Primary prevention can also look like teaching people how to create strong, respectful relationships that can buffer them from becoming at risk, and teaching them how not to harm other people. Some of these skills might include respecting people's bodies, learning to accept no for an answer. It can look like a lot of different things. These skills help people have those healthy relationships with themselves and others and build the support networks they need to stay safe. Primary prevention can also look like economic stability and preventing poverty. So we're trying to prevent those vulnerabilities caused by a lack of transportation, underemployment, lack of access to documents. Some of these things might be in a direct service capacity, but they have a preventative quality to them. It can also look like giving people leadership opportunities to develop their talents, teaching working rights, and creating self-advocacy and healthier working conditions so that sexual exploitation does not become an option. There are lots of different ways, again, this can happen, but these are just a few examples. And finally, primary prevention can look like culture change to reduce demand and social acceptance of exploitation. It can be applied in lots of different ways, but the idea is to challenge how normalized exploitation is, that this is an okay practice to do. And so we might have programming or efforts to promote bodily autonomy, consent-based practices, bystander intervention, lots of different other activities that could be done. And generally, we want to stop making it okay to exploit and abuse other people, and to create a sense of cultural accountability and connection to other people using empathy and other social emotional skills. We'll get into each strategy a little bit more, but I wanted to give you a sense for what primary prevention can look like in the context of trafficking prevention. And so I'll let Sarah talk a little bit about education as one of those strategies next.
Sorry about that. I was just talking to myself on mute for a minute. All right, one of the goals for this webinar today was really to help teams and folks that are interested in developing local protocols to really figure out how to incorporate these different types of prevention into your work, and whether or not that's something that the team would do or something that the team would be able to kind of outsource to other professionals who are doing this work. So the first strategy that we're going to be talking about is education and outreach to youth. So this is really talking and working directly with young people to increase awareness of issues around exploitation and trafficking, to encourage self-esteem development, promoting healthy relationships and sexuality, and then encouraging leadership. So this is a lot of this very general kind of overall prevention education for youth, both at risk and not at risk.
Yeah, and as Sarah explained, education is a powerful tool, and there are a variety of educational strategies that can be used. Education is always a form of primary prevention because it gives people that knowledge and skills needed to create those healthy relationships in communities. But keep in mind that there is no golden ticket educational strategy. For example, teaching consent is just one very useful tool in our prevention toolkit, but that tool alone will not prevent trafficking as a whole. Instead, we need to use many different tools to help stop and prevent exploitation. Ideally, these programs should be ongoing and sustained. So those short-term, one-time presentations that Adrienne mentioned earlier often don't give people time to practice and incorporate new skills into their lives. So education, such as healthy relationship curriculum, consent-based work, comprehensive sex ed, or bystander intervention training, all those things need to be ongoing and varied to be successful.
All right, so we also wanted to provide some examples of these different strategies. And we are in no way attempting to be comprehensive here, but just to give all of you an idea of the types of things available, the types of things that we're talking about that are trafficking and exploitation specific. So our example for education is the Not a Number curriculum, which is a child trafficking and exploitation prevention curriculum. It's designed to raise awareness of human trafficking and exploitation, to help youth recognize recruitment tactics and also their own vulnerabilities, to challenge harmful stereotypes, to help young people identify those healthy support systems for themselves, and to develop skills to safely navigate potential and existing exploitative situations. So Not a Number can be used in schools, juvenile justice facilities, a variety of youth serving programs, including after school or other community-based programs. The curriculum is designed for youth ages 12 to 18 of all gender identities, all racial and ethnic backgrounds, and all socioeconomic statuses. Now, again, kind of like Adri mentioned earlier, this curriculum is designed to work with all those folks. How well it does that, every curriculum has its pros and cons. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes curriculums need to be adapted for your specific audience. But Not a Number is a pretty great curriculum, and Minnesota has spent we've invested pretty heavily in getting this training available kind of across the state. So there are a number of safe harbor service providers and other folks that are trained to facilitate Not a Number curriculum. Oh, yep, Mel just chatted in. Mel Alvar from PABSA, she's also a Safe Harbor Regional Navigator, is one of the trainers for the Not a Number Facilitator Certificate.
Sarah, just jumping in real quick too, I found out today that there will be 2 trainings this summer if folks are interested in getting certified. So definitely check that out if that's something you're interested in.
Yep, absolutely. And if you want more information about that training, I know the email went out to some safe harbor providers, but if you would like that information, didn't receive it, please let me know. In the meantime, if you don't know who in your area is trained to facilitate Not a Number, you can talk to your regional navigator, or you can contact Paula Schaefer at the Minnesota Department of Health. She has a list of the ever expanding number of folks in Minnesota that are trained on this curriculum.
And just continuing with our chat about education and curriculum, MnCASA reviewed a variety of educational curricular programs and posted a list of these programs on our website. You can access that under our prevention efforts link on our webpage. And you can check out that list for examples of how different folks are using education as a form of primate prevention. So take a look at that if you have a chance. There's several excellent programs on there.
Right. So another strategy that we can use both individually and as multidisciplinary groups is to end demand. So that really does focus on teaching people not to buy sex and not to sexually objectify other people. And it also focuses on regulating those businesses that profit from sexual exploitation. So this particular strategy speaks to that larger societal change, including things like how we view masculinity.
And here's a graphic of how that relationship, that business model looks. This graphic focuses on ending demand for sex for pay using a business model of trafficking. So here, supply is defined as people who are being exploited, particularly those who are the most vulnerable, such as women and girls, young men and boys, LGBTQ people, people with addictions, mental illness. And here, demand describes those who pay for sex. Distributors are identified as either traffickers or pimps as form of the distribution process of giving people access to sex for pay. So primate prevention models would help change the culture of exploitation by teaching men and boys, for example, not to pay for sex. That helps eliminate that demand element of exploitation. So we'll talk a little bit about a couple of different strategies on here, but changing that cultural norm around masculinity and teaching men to express their masculine selves in healthy ways that doesn't include exploiting other people is one example of how that demand is addressed. Moreover, this model incorporates business regulation, making it difficult for those businesses or entities that enable trafficking or distribution. So we might hold businesses accountable in this model as well. And primate prevention wants to stop people from becoming exploited, and we want to go as far upstream as possible. So we're trying to prevent people from becoming vulnerable, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation in our section on early intervention. But we want to get as far upstream so that people don't become at risk for becoming trafficking victims. Together, all these strategies can help end that cycle of demand, distribution, and supply.
All right, an example of this strategy that we're using in Minnesota is the Don't Buy It project from Men as Peacemakers. This is a community learning and engagement curriculum that really strives to be a resource for both men and others in the community who are trying to end demand. It focuses on the ways that culture has normalized and glorified sexual exploitation and contributed to the oppression of a variety of different groups. This website is available. They have training, they have research, they have educational programs, tools and resources that communities can use to educate themselves and other folks on how to change your framework of thinking about sexual exploitation and trafficking.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how early intervention is a little bit different from primate prevention. Early intervention is not as far upstream as primate prevention. Early intervention is really focused on those populations who are more acutely at risk for being trafficked or from engaging in sex for pay and the exploitation of others. These are, again, we're talking about victim survivor populations who may or may not have been trafficked at this point, but may have experienced other kinds of harm or have significant challenges that make them vulnerable. Another part of the early intervention strategy is to stop that demand. So getting a little bit closer to the issue than we would with primary prevention, which is a much more general healthy relationship skill development. So early intervention is tailored to those who are most at risk. Ideally, they should try to identify what those populations are. We need to know who is vulnerable, and we might want to use indicators such as low income, mental health diagnoses, LGBTQI youth, and other programs that are at risk. We know that these groups are much more likely to be funneled into exploitative situations, and we want to target services to help buffer them from entering that cycle. Polaris, for example, has a Stay Safe booklet for LGBTQ youth, and it asks youth to look out for their friends, and if they're experiencing homelessness, how they can help their friends and loved ones stay safe from trafficking. So that's an example of identifying a community that is at risk and then using their creative partnerships to help them stay safe. So that project did a good job identifying who is at risk. Another element of early prevention is, again, continuing family wellness. It looks a little bit different than primary prevention, but still has some of the same qualities to it. We want to continue to support the well-being of the whole family for those at-risk populations and increase parent-guardian youth communication, healthy family attachments to prevent those vulnerabilities from getting worse or becoming more acute. So we want to prevent those families from having further disruption. Again, healthy relationship skills are useful at this stage as well, and they may need to be a little bit more targeted and specific for those groups, and they should be culturally competent to make sure that they're meeting their needs. Again, economic stability, leadership and work opportunities for at-risk populations. teaching folks working rights, changing working environments that are exploitative to prevent people from getting that much closer and that much more at risk for entering the cycle of trafficking. And again, stopping the demand, directly working with people who we know tend to buy sex and explaining how to express their sexual selves in ways that are healthy and well and whole for themselves. Keeping those businesses accountable so they stop enabling trafficking, so we can stop that cycle of demand and distribution.
All right, so some strategies for early intervention programming are basically providing resources to victims and survivors of exploitation and trafficking. So we do a lot of that in Minnesota. The early intervention programming that we do involves shelter and housing support, educational support, job training programs, healthcare, and mental and chemical health services as well. So a lot of the work that the direct service providers on this webinar do is really a piece of early intervention programming in a huge way. An example of that early intervention programming is the Safe Harbor Regional Navigators. So for those of you not super familiar with those folks, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a kind of a primer. So currently Minnesota has 8 Safe Harbor Regional Navigators, and their job is to be the main point of contact for youth who've been sexually exploited and for the agencies that work with these youth. They're there to connect young people with services and then provide expertise to local communities. So they can provide training on how to work with these youth. They can provide other resources if you need, if you want your organization to get a training on trafficking and exploitation of youth, kind of 101, your navigators can be someone that you might reach out to for that, or more specific guidance on individual cases. This is a map of the Safe Harbor Regional Navigators, at least as they stand right now. Currently, there are 8 divided into these regions. There is currently a request for proposals out, so this will be changing, but not anytime soon. So for right now, these are your regional navigators. Feel free to contact them with questions. Please remember to loop them in. If you know you're working with kids who are exploited or trafficked, it's always a good idea to get a hold of the navigator because then they can coordinate services. Oh, and I wanted to add on that last piece, any additional information you might want about Safe Harbor Navigators or about supportive services are available online on the MDH website.
Great. Another prevention strategy includes policy and systems change. Policy has the power to shift our daily lives in ways you don't even notice or typically think about. Often policies can create or alter social and cultural norms. So these policy and systems change through legislation or through local bills can have a direct influence on our individual behaviors. Policy also has a broad impact, especially in prevention, because it directly affects a large number of people at once and can have a broad application for many people. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of this strategy is that it needs to be upheld and enforced. So that means that for it to work, that people need to actually be applying the policy. And if people aren't following the policy or not being held accountable, then the policy loses its power. And that's why it's important to know what prevention policies are actually in place and how to best follow them and maintain them. Thankfully, policy can exist on many levels. It can be workplace policies, a local community policy, a state or even federal policy are some examples of how prevention policy can take place and at those different levels. Keep in mind that you do have a voice in policy. We can all speak to leadership and our representatives when we notice flaws or omissions in policy. We can vote on policies and even create bills if we see a need. Since policy can have a major impact, we need to use our voices and create the change we want to see and shift those policies toward prevention-based efforts.
All right, so one of the advantages of Safe Harbor protocol development teams is the fact that they are really rooted in this policy and systems change area. They're really working on not only influencing kind of normal cultural behaviors and attitudes, but they're also in a position to apply those new policies, protocols, recommendations on a multidisciplinary level and up to the top. So it's really kind of the perfect spot for protocol teams to be focused and really understanding that this protocol development work, this systems change work really is a piece of prevention. And protocol teams have a really unique advantage over a lot of other multidisciplinary teams and individual agencies in that they have a variety of members at a variety of different levels of authority and power. They also have the flexibility and the expertise to come at problems from a multitude of different areas. And this speaks a little bit to the spectrum of prevention that Adriana was talking about earlier in terms of the reach that protocol teams have. So one of the things that we really focus on with the protocol teams is looking at policy and systems change as being part of a prevention effort within itself. All right, so an example of what policy and systems change can do is the safe harbor legislation in Minnesota. In 2005, we passed our first anti-trafficking laws. In 2006, we created the Minnesota Human Trafficking Task Force. In 2008, a needs assessment was done to identify the gaps in services and kind of what the landscape of sex trafficking and exploitation looked like in Minnesota. In 2009, we enacted some laws to increase penalties for traffickers and purchasers. And then the key legislation was passed in 2011, where we enacted the Safe Harbor Law, which added the definition of sexually exploited youth into the Minnesota Child Protection Codes. It increased further the penalties for abusers and purchasers. And then it provided that directive for a statewide response to be developed. A number of the pieces of the 2011 legislation were then enacted and took effect in 2014 to allow our systems some time to adjust and adapt, to create new programs where we were lacking, and to get people trained on how to work with these youth. So in 2014, sexually exploited youth were officially excluded from the definition of a delinquent child. In layman's terms, what that means is, as of August 1st, 2014, they decriminalized prostitution for youth under the age of 18. And then the no wrong door model was implemented. During the period from 2011 to 2014, work was done in a huge statewide effort to really see not only what was needed, but how best to get all of our different disciplines together to work to serve these youth best. And in 2016, we included some labor trafficking, and we also were able to expand safe harbor services for youth up to age 24.
Sarah, can I just add before we flip forward? Sorry. Like you had mentioned earlier, I think folks who are on these teams and working together, you really have a unique insight into what are the gaps that are in policy for the folks you're working with and serving. So you get to see directly what are people reporting to you, how their experience look, and what's either missing or what's just not working well. And when we think about policy, we sometimes get stuck in this idea that it's really up high, state and federal level. We can't have really any influence in it. And all of that is super valid and understandable, but really looking at what is happening to the folks you're working with, what are their experiences, where are their biggest challenges and barriers and these gaps that you're finding, and using that to then inform what needs to change and what needs to happen, which is really part of all of our roles. And I think people doing safe harbor work also have this unique insight and role into making these shifts and addressing policy in a way that other people across the state in other positions don't have. So I think it's just a really unique framework for people doing safe harbor work to hold and look at and see how can they engage in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that the no wrong door model that we use in Minnesota has, one of the unique advantages, and our response in general to trafficking and exploitation of youth, is the fact that we have been using kind of an iterative model, right? We're building the plane as we fly it, which means that we're adapting and making changes. When we're seeing gaps, we're addressing those. We're trying to do that in a fluid way. And our protocol teams are trying to do this on a slightly smaller scale. For those of you who are on a team, you've definitely heard me talk about the phases of systems change and how systems change is a cyclical process. This is something that's ongoing. You'll constantly be fine-tuning it, finding new gaps, finding new changes, finding new areas where you can step in and help. And so the state is doing that as well. The no wrong door model really was intended to provide a multidisciplinary, collaborative, and comprehensive response to youth who've been exploited and trafficked. The idea being that wherever a youth goes for help, they will receive help, that there is no wrong door for youth to go through to receive services. So the no wrong door model consists of regional navigators, housing and shelter services, and other supportive services, as well as protocol development. Ideally, this is how Safe Harbor is supposed to work here in Minnesota, with the youth at the center, surrounded by their family, peers, and community, and then with a variety of service providers kind of encircling them and interconnecting with each other. And this is how protocol teams hopefully are also operating. We're doing victim-centered work, and we're working together on a number of different levels to connect and try to improve our services. In this particular model, the regional navigators are identified by this weird little dotted line. And as you can see, that means that they're connecting everyone to each other and to the youth as well. Protocol development is really intended to strengthen that no wrong door response in specific communities. It's something that, you know, we aim to do statewide, and we'd like to do it perfectly, but we need to start with our individual communities and our local responses. Just a little bit more information on the Minnesota Safe Harbor response. It is a statewide collaboration. There are 3 governmental branches, as well as MNCASA, that do work within Safe Harbor: the Department of Health, the Department of Human Services, and then the Department of Public Safety. If you want more information on what they are all doing, feel free to reach out to me, or again, you can find a lot of information on the MDH website.
All right, so we're getting close to the end of our webinar, and I wanted to give folks some time to sort of reflect on what we've learned and talked about with prevention. This picture shows a model that the Northern California Anti-Trafficking Coalition and what they use to demonstrate the array of anti-trafficking responses. And I thought it would be a helpful way to think about how we can explore prevention work. If you look on the right side of the screen, you'll notice that there are a variety of programs that can fit into any of these trafficking response strategies. So healthy family development, safe housing, language classes, ending the objectification of women. Again, it shows that there's no one golden ticket prevention strategy, and that together, all of these different strategies contribute to meaningful work around trafficking. So look at this graphic, kind of reflect on what you've learned in this webinar, and ask yourself, where do you currently fit into community-wide solutions? What is your capacity for prevention? What would that look like for you and your team? So take some time to think. Feel free to chime in using the chat function, or if you prefer to use your video voice function, you can do that as well, or you could take these questions back to your team to explore together. I'll give folks a minute to think and to share. Feel free to type in or chime in by voice, whatever you prefer.
All right. And as hopefully people continue to comment or chat in responses, I will also put out the call for additional questions or comments. We've got plenty of time, so if folks want to either chat in questions or I can unmute the participants so we can hear your voices. All right, everyone is unmuted, so if you don't have a question, please mute yourself.
This could be a really good time for folks to chat in or unmute and share any prevention efforts their team or their community is already doing. So we're open to hear kind of what is happening on your teams that is already looking like prevention, or what are you maybe hoping to adapt to become more prevention focused. Oh, we got a great question around recommendations for prevention efforts in this current time of COVID-19 happening. That is a great question. MnCASA is putting out a list of resources that are all prevention based. If you are on our prevention listserv, you will be getting that tomorrow. And if you are a member program, it went out in our member update and it's on our member forums. So if you are interested in joining that or gaining access to that and you aren't already on our listserv, please reach out to us and we will get you on there. But it is going to be a comprehensive Google form that will have a wide list of prevention resources, from interactive websites to reports, webinars. We're really trying to build this gap of people who are on one side of the spectrum of like needing something to do for prevention right now, all the way to we were doing prevention and now we can't do it because our efforts are being pulled elsewhere in our organization, or we were really connected with schools and schools look really different. So really trying to provide a wide range of resources for folks. We also hold prevention phone calls, member calls, if you are a member program. And people had some really great recommendations for prevention work happening right now, whether that's finding ways to record curriculum so schools can still do that if you were already working with a school to do presentations or a number of specific curriculum. How can you adapt that to now help with the virtual learning? So those would be direct resources I would recommend for prevention efforts right now. Otherwise, Sam and I are always available to do some brainstorming conversation around what are kind of your ideas and how can we start implementing them.
Yep. And for those of you from organizations that aren't member programs, which is, since this is such a multidisciplinary response, pretty likely that there's a number of you that are not, please feel free to reach out to us for whatever resources you need. We are still available to help. Adriana and Sam and myself are all available to talk through prevention with you all.
Yes.
I do want to just acknowledge that this is a really strange time. And obviously we prepared this webinar prior to some of the stay-at-home requirements that have been put into place. So, you know, it's hard to talk about community efforts and education and all types of in-person responses in a situation where those things are difficult, if not impossible. So we are also here to talk about that with you. We're all going through this and kind of learning together.
Yeah, and anyone can join our listserv. You don't have to be a member to be on the prevention listserv. I would also encourage you all to check out our social media. We're going to have a bunch of really awesome resources coming out for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is in April. So we really try and get as many tools as we can out to people in a really broad way beyond just our membership too. So trying to keep something special for our members while also knowing our members alone cannot be doing prevention work. We need all of you engaged in it in different ways. So any way you can be directly contacting us or following us, you will get access to really awesome prevention resources that are coming out.
All right, so we're not getting any additional questions or comments in, which is understandable because you're all working from home and many of you are trying to deal with families and pets and a number of other work obligations. So please feel free to contact us anytime with any questions that you might have. If you have ideas that you want to brainstorm, if you're wondering how your team can implement some of these prevention efforts. And for those of you who are interested in forming a team or becoming part of a team or coming up with a coordinated local response, get a hold of us. That's what we're here to do. So thank you all very much. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
It was great talking with you.
All right. And again, this webinar has been recorded, so I will be sending the video out. Oh, and we have a comment. Of course. All right. Noelle from Menace Peacemaker. All right, just kind of reiterating, yep, absolutely reinforcing everyone has a role to play in prevention, and systems change really is that process. Community level prevention is changing conditions in the community that result in certain groups being targeted. This is a big change, and that requires everyone from all disciplines, every system, to play a role in creating that large change. All right. And a shout out to all of you for doing this amazing work. You are wonderful. All right. And with that, I am going to stop the recording. Get a hold of us if you have any questions. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.